Welcome to another episode of The Impact of AI and Data. Each week, we explore how data impacts us both daily, professionally, and personally. And the perfect person to explore that with me today is Lisa Palmer. Lisa is the Chief AI Strategist and Ethicist for a boutique consulting firm, AI Leaders, and she also is wrapping up her I wasn't sure if it was completed yet, but wrapping up her doctorate in education in artificial intelligence with a thesis statement that artificial intelligence are for-profit entities using do the right thing governance to drive business results. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Melissa.
Our podcast wouldn't be here if we didn't have our sponsors. Our sponsor this week is Wilda, Women Leaders in Data and Artificial Intelligence. Lisa, let's just dive right into this. I've seen you post recently around some of the content of your doctorate. Your articles that you've written have not only been on LinkedIn, but also within the Oklahoma digital newspapers. You're in Oklahoma, I assume.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually, there's a funny story behind that. I was required for one of my doctoral courses to write something that advocated for a policy change. I was in a legal class as part of my doctorate. And so I was required as part of the class to write an opinion article that was actually picked up by the Oklahoman, which is our largest paper here in our state. And it was all part of an assignment, and it worked out fantastically for me because it gave me some time to do some research and to write about something I really care about.
I'd like to dive into the concepts or the themes of your doctorate.
Right. So what led me to this particular thesis is that for years, I have heard customers say we're doing the right thing when they're asked about how are they choosing to govern something? How do they decide what they will and will not pursue? I just over and over again would hear people tell me that we just do the right thing. Even during my tenure at Gartner, I would hear that from customers, and we even had that same approach with regard to AI inside of Gartner that would come up over and over again. And so when I decided to pursue my doctorate, I wanted to know, what does that really mean? How do they decide what doing the right thing is? And what are the repercussions, largely unintended repercussions, when doing the right thing in one vein of thinking doesn't lead to that same result elsewhere? Mm-hmm. So I dug into this question, big picture. I have been looking for three primary things. What actions are being taken against So I'm looking for three primary things. I want to know what decisions are being made, what actions are being taken, and what are the results? What is the company experiencing as a result of that? And I wanted the data to be very current. I felt like it was really important for it to be current. I am doing an embedded dissertation, which means that your coursework and your dissertation process are happening together. Quite literally, you have pieces of your dissertation work that are embedded in each course throughout your program. And so I wanted to make sure that I was, keeping a really tight focus on enterprises so that we could have a realistic view into what's actually happening. Not what we wanted to have happen, but what's actually happening. And so to do that, I decided to focus on using podcasts as my data source. And what I learned is that number one, academics do not love you being the first one to want to do something. Right? The entire point is that you're building on an existing body of work, right? So I had to find someone who had done this to get it approved to use podcasts as my data source, because due to that embedded dissertation, this is a very short timeline. So I wasn't going to have time to find the people, get them scheduled, and to conduct all these one-on-one interviews in comparison to all of this rich source of podcast data that's been created ever since the pandemic started. So as a result of that, it took some heavy lifting. I was able to find one study that was done way somewhere else around the globe, and that had used podcasts as a data source and was able to get that approved. And it's just been a treasure trove of information for me as I went to do my data analysis. So I actually identified 172 episodes that were tangentially associated with this particular topic, and ultimately narrowed that down to 46 specific scenarios that are included in my study.
When will that study be available?
So I am right now, I have half a chapter left to write, and I need to get it to anyway, long story short, I'm trying to defend my dissertation the last week of January.
Got it.
And so it would be at some point after that when it's approved. When it's approved.
One of the things that I read in the the abstract was formal regulation. Businesses are actively innovating with AI using their own self-adopted policies. And I want to go in deeper on that one. So from my own experience, I've come to, talking to other organizations. In 2022, organizations were, in some cases, like the IT category, because that's where a lot of these AI technologies are coming through, working with up to 30% net new suppliers in 2022 that they've never worked with before. And that's because of this rise in the mid-market and the startup, because AI technologies have now become more accessible than where they were 5 years ago. But on the flip side, in talking to a lot of these mid-markets and startups, most of them went straight into building their own business. A lot of them don't have a business background. A lot of them are really fantastically smart. But your comment there about using their own self-adopting policies, I'm finding that trend to be very relevant to your thesis, but also very becoming much more normal, which creates this not tension between a mid-market or a supplier and an organization, but just this constant fluctuating. I've got this product, I'm using AI. Enterprise is coming back with, well, I don't know if you're using AI. How can I trust that? And are you sure you're using AI? And what kind of questions should I be asking to ensure that? So given that kind of my own experiences and reading that comment, is this where you're leaning towards within your thesis?
So where I wanted to really get to the brass tacks per se is I wanted to know, what are companies actually doing? Like, what is working, what is not working, what are the repercussions? So what I have found is companies are actually effectively using AI in 3 ways: for efficiency of internal processes, for revenue opportunities, so new or extending revenue opportunities, and then 3, risk avoidance, which is huge. There's a proliferation of organizations using AI for risk avoidance in one way, shape, or form. Specifically, what are they doing from a policy perspective? The truth of it is, people are largely flying by the seat of their pants. Right. There is no policy. They are the ones who are being successful are very carefully picking a specific problem. So think use case or a very specific situation, and they are staying laser focused on that. There's some key elements of it. For example, having an internal champion who is an internal, vested in their outcomes champion who is credible inside of their own organization is a consistent thread through every successful situation I've found. So that individual has tremendous power in this process because they largely don't have a policy. That person is largely leading based on, of course, their own experience, as well as what is culturally working inside of that specific organization. So what this means from my perspective is that these individuals could be creating unintended consequences because of they don't have this huge diversity of viewpoints helping them to build a solution that isn't going to have unintended outcomes. They are really just staying focused on creating whatever this one particular outcome is. Now, so it does introduce some risk for organizations because there's not a lot of thought going into the unintended ramifications of whatever it is they put in place. However, these efforts are absolutely creating business value for their organizations. It's certainly an effort worth pursuing. But this idea of this champion playing such a key role, I think, is super important for people to understand what that means to your organization, both from a positivity perspective as well as, manage your own risk.
You mentioned a moment ago, ones that are really successful are very laser focused on, here's a business challenge, I'm creating this application to solve that. Yep. But if we focus on the larger portion of the other half of that statement, are you thinking that maybe there'll be a trend where these companies that are trying to be too broad, that don't have a formal policy or governance in developing that application, that those will be the ones that will tend to slide off into the abyss?
There's actually quite a lot of, there is certainly evidence that the organizations who attempt things too broadly, they never actually accomplish anything.
Okay.
So, or let me put it this way. These are organizations that I've studied that the furthest one back is 3 years ago. So these are very current. I think the latest one was April of 22 was the latest podcast episode that I used. So it's a very tight time frame, but those organizations inside of that space who did not take this kind of laser focused approach still haven't deployed anything. They still have the business problem. And there isn't a single exception to that in my data.
Wow. I have to think about this. I've got like 50 questions. I just kind of want to keep it, again, very, very focused. I completely lost my train of thought. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So how about I share a little bit about about a couple of the things that I've seen be successful in this.
Yeah. So let me, yeah, that's a good, let me phrase the question and then I'll cut all this out. So let's turn back now to those that maybe through your experience, you've seen successful, where there's a certain theme that was running through these companies that you feel made them more successful than the others.
I think the theme is interest, excitement, willingness, the right spirit, that you've got somebody that is going to take leadership, that really believes that it is possible to create a better outcome using data and AI specifically. So without a doubt, that specific thing plays out over and over again. You've got somebody that is an excited champion who identifies in the organization others who are interested in, who are really positive and want to be involved, want to help to create this, kind of new way of operating, create this new outcome. That having that nucleus from a teaming perspective is the thing that I feel like is the common thread over and over again. You've got this champion and they go and recruit other people who are really excited about making it happen. They envision a new way of working and then they bring it to life. And that seems to be a really common thread. So the team that is assembled, depending on the diversity of perspectives or viewpoints that they bring to the table, I feel like that is kind of the secret sauce to whether or not these individual use cases are able to be scaled. So the interesting thing about that is that even though in these successful situations, even though they started out with this super laser focus, in at least a handful of the situations, they have been able to take the learnings and some of the foundational tech that they created through that laser focused use case, and they've been able to scale that into other parts of their business, even though they didn't plan for it. So what I believe, and I'm not complete with my data analysis yet, but what I believe at this point is that that is being impacted, their ability to do that is being impacted by the quality of diversity of viewpoints that are engaged on the team from the beginning.
But enthusiasm and belief isn't a foundational pillar of success. I mean, that can only carry you so far.
True. But because artificial intelligence has so much to do with culture, because it's not a traditional IT project, and you can't think of it and approach it like a traditional IT project. And so it has so much of a cultural component to it that you can't remove that human factor of somebody having the belief and demonstrating the leadership to show how it can work and to keep people encouraged, because when you're building AI, you are not, it's an iterative process. You don't just, it's not waterfall, you're just boom, 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 going through the process like you would in an IT project. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have times that, oops, that didn't do what we wanted. We're going to have to try something else. And, where you have to refocus. And so what I believe is that that's why this role of the champion and those on the team is so critical in an AI project, because it is really culture change. It's really dealing with the mentality shift that has to happen to embrace this different way of coming up with business solutions via technology. It doesn't look and feel like it used to. So you need somebody that's going to be resilient when you have those minor setbacks.
If we take everything that you've pulled together today, there are companies out there, suppliers that are going to succeed, and there are companies obviously that are probably going to, what I mentioned, fall into the abyss and fail. But I think what I'm hearing is even the ones that fail, because the culture of utilizing these technologies, not the standard structured waterfall approach, that the failures are good, because then if you've got the right champion in place, they'll just come back with, smarter, better, stronger.
I believe that's absolutely the case, that as long as you have somebody that is going to, you've got to have support in the organization too. I mean, if you've got, if you're trying to get resourcing for projects, no matter whether they're a traditional IT or whether they're IT projects or anything else, you've got to have resourcing to make those projects really come to life. And so what I would say is that for those that are in danger of falling into the abyss, you don't have a specific, actual, real, created, tangible outcome. Mm-hmm. Organizations that in the vendor space, so the ones who are being successful are industry focused. They have an industry focused use case where they have created real AI, not services, but they have an actual product that they are bringing bringing to the market, and it's usually industry based and a very specific use case. And those are the ones that get a foothold, and they're able to create value for their customers and continue to create value at customer after customer.
Some of the, I read some of the articles that you've written, and there are references to policy, federal, state regulation, policy, and this is still a very fluid time. A lot of the policies may be there, but they're lacking in substantive quality that could provide, a visible impact. Do you think that as we continue, not just in the US, but globally, pushing more and more with the regulation and those AI type Bill of Rights and policies, that that's going to hurt or harm the suppliers trying to be so innovative?
Well, I think that we have to keep in mind that regulations benefit big tech companies. Mm. So because regulations tend to restrict competition, they tend to make it harder for new entrants in the market. So it is to the benefit of supersized tech companies who want to compete in any particular space to help put regulations in place. They wouldn't necessarily want to have that when they were startups or, early in their growth. But when you've got a big foothold in the market, it actually can be to your benefit. So I think that there is a possibility for it to restrict innovation. I mean, I think that possibility is very real. However, the reality in the United States is that policies are being set by us, by other countries. So let's take GDPR as a good example. That policy was obviously set outside of the United States, but all of the American companies who operate internationally have all set their operating standards based upon GDPR. It's become the de facto standard inside of the United States, irrespective of the fact that we don't have something that is akin to that. So the same thing is about to happen to us with artificial intelligence. The EU is likely to pass their AI Act that is risk-based. Canada's right there following a very similar path. I mean, this is likely to happen, and that kind of federal standard per se is being set elsewhere. So irregardless of whether we set this regulation at a federal level in the United States, which right now seems unlikely for the short term, it's being parsed out into individual regulatory agencies. And I think that the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights that came out earlier this year, and if you saw that, if you saw the big kind of dog and pony show of when they rolled that out, all of the regulatory heads were sitting at the table talking about what their piece of that was going to be. So I think that it's unlikely that we're going to see a federal level AI Act, at least in the fairly short term, but it's going to be a little bit, I think, it's not really going to matter at some level, because those standards are going to be set in other parts of the world, and companies that want to be able to operate outside of the US are probably going to have to set up operations to adhere to those. And that will mean that our standards are going to be set based on a risk-based system by sheer fact of someone else setting that standard. So I do think that innovation is at risk in this space. So I would say that my counsel is look at what's being done with the risk-based systems, with what is being what is being debated in the EU's AI Act, because it, depending on how you create your technology and which of those risk categories you fall into, that will likely be an indicator about how much risk your organization is going to take on from an innovation restriction perspective. So if you're in that high risk category with the tech that you're trying to create, you're going to be at high risk of being regulated. So if you think through how do we get, into a low risk or not even on the regulated, there are a lot of things that are not even going to fall into their risk system at all. So that's what I would say, Melissa, is if you're when you're thinking about what you're going to do with your product, take a look at that risk-based system and find out where you're going to fit in that.
I think, listening to you, and you've had some really good observations, because I didn't think that I understood until now that we're not really writing the policy. We're not the forward thinkers in these types of policies. It's really being written by, and I'll clarify, the EU, and
Yep.
eventually we're just following along. And I didn't understand that until now, that that could be a disadvantage for American companies, that we're not jumping out in front and trying to be the leader in these policies and regulations, but rather eventually just stepping back and adopting what someone else has written, and then deploying that and deploying that as an umbrella to the rest of the companies here in the US.
I think that we are creating a very difficult environment for US companies. So, for example, we now have laws and regulations that are in state by state.
Mm-hmm.
We have differences in data laws now between different states that have been adopted. What does that mean if you're a company that's just trying to operate inside of the United States? What does that mean? You've got to have somebody go assess all of those different state laws, and then you try to build something that's going to make you compliant across all of those. That I call it a patchwork, Melissa. We have a patchwork of laws and regulations just inside of the United States. And then if an organization wants to compete internationally, you've got a whole nother layer
Mm-hmm.
that you've got to be prepared to take on. So I think that we've created a very difficult environment, and we're not leading. And so that means that a lot of the decisions that are being made aren't even being made with an America first type of a lens.
Right. As we look to wrap up today, I think that the takeaways that I've gotten is that 3 years ago, when I started talking more about the impact of AI, not just personally, because we realized that AI is everywhere and has been for a long time, but we didn't have it tagged or labeled as such. This is still fluid. And I think, the other things that I'm hearing today is that the fluidity that we're experiencing isn't going to go isn't going to leave us or go away anytime soon, which I thought would have been very hopeful, given 2022 and what we've been able to accomplish within the last 3 years. So as we look to wrap up, Lisa, given everything that you've looked at with your data and the topics that we've talked about today, do you have any insights on the future?
Well, here's what I like to tell people, that when I think about artificial intelligence in today's environment, because things are incredibly fluid, there's a lot of progress being made. I mean, I'm super bullish about what's going to happen in 2023. I never would want someone to come away from a conversation about this discouraged from me, because I am bullish for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But here are the things that I think of in whole. One, I would like to see us focus on the outcomes that AI is creating. So there's this treasure trove of conversation going on around transparency and explainability, and all these things are super important. But for the immediate term, I would really like us to just get focused on what are the outcomes that are being created by AI, and are we creating positive and equitable outcomes? Let's just start there. And then for anybody that's not creating one, if we start on the outcomes, for anybody that's not creating that kind of positive, equitable outcome, then they have to go back and figure out why. The onus is on them to figure out, from a transparency and explainability perspective, where it's going wrong. But if we've got to focus on outcomes, so that we, number one, drive business impacts, because we need to do this. And number two, that we don't create any unintended harm along that path. So that focus on outcomes is my first one. The second one for me is that ownership is a big deal right now. So generative AI is exploding. So who owns artwork that is created by generative AI, or code, or videos, or music, et cetera, et cetera?
Mhm.
That ownership question is super important. And to me, whoever uses the tool to create the outcome owns what they create. So that ownership piece is really big to me. And then, and that piece about who owns it, that's what I believe. I believe that whoever uses the tool to create that owns the outcome. That is also still not been, that's another fluid topic, right? But
Yeah.
that one's really big to me. And then the third piece is that we need to assign accountability where the revenue is generated. So right now, largely, there is no accountability for creating AI that does unintentionally create harm. There's no accountability for that. And so in my mind, we want to focus on creating accountability from a policy perspective that aligns revenue with accountability. So if the company that created the AI is marketing, selling, profiting from that artificial intelligence that is unintentionally, and it's always unintentionally, no one's doing this on purpose. If it's unintentionally creating harm, then we need to align the accountability there so that it incents that organization to go back and make sure that they are tweaking that AI to create, again, outcomes that are positive and equitable.
That's a lot, but I absolutely love that. Thank you so much. You are one of the few people where I would love to have this reoccurring conversation once a year. I think finishing up your thesis, working in the real world based on what you've observed and the patterns that you've illustrated today. I'd love to have you back again.
It would be my absolute pleasure, Melissa. It's always fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa.